All right, so what I want to do is just talk a little bit about the Success Insights wheel and basically transition from the style analysis graph to kind of how we plot the style analysis graphs onto the Success Insights wheel inside of a TTI DISC report. So again, maybe applications to coaching or training, or you're doing a debrief, or you're just trying to explain the graph pretty quickly in training. It's a great way to do that. By the way, sorry about this. It's kind of an inject webinar here, but more like my 2-minute blog post. This is Coach Bob, and like I said, I'm going to walk you through just a really easy way to kind of explain this information, hopefully to your people. But if you have any questions or anything, feel free to fire me an email. Of course, rpeter@insightstoimprovement.com, and get connected, and I can review yours with you and walk you through the process. It's pretty straightforward. So the key here is everybody's usually pretty familiar with the style insights, or the style insights graphs, the graph 1 and 2, graph 2 being the natural core style, graph 1 being the adaptive style. And we do those debriefs in the reports and get people to identify core styles and all of those things. So the question becomes kind of how do we get these graph 1s and 2s over into the wheel? So what I try to do when I do the training is I actually have my participants go ahead and plot data points on top of the bar graphs here in regards to the graphs so that they can connect the lines. And you'll see in a minute when we look at the wheel graphic illustrates these graphs 1s and 2s actually in line graph format. So it's a little bit easier visually for people to make this connection, and it keeps the explanation very, very straightforward. So here's actually the wheel. So again, the wheel represents is 60 of the different graph 1s and 2s. If you're TTI DISC certified training person, there's 384 graphs that get generated by the 24 responses. So 60 of those graphs are put onto the Success Insights wheel. Okay, so there's no mathematical equations going on here necessarily trying to explain those or anything of that nature. It's just basically best fit exercise. Okay, so the way to keep this simple is just describe it as whatever best fit in regards to graph 1 or 2 as it matches the graphs that show up on the 60 for the wheel will dictate whether the plot point goes there. So for graph number 1, the adaptive graphs, people will have a star placed on their wheel, and that star will be representative of whatever line graph or the graph inside of the wheel quadrant looks most like their graph number 1. The same thing with graph number 2. Okay, and that's going to be a dot plot on their Success Insights wheel. So that's how the graph 1 and graph 2s get placed on the wheels, basically best fit with regards to the closest match within these 60 different graphs as it relates to their graph 1s and 2s. So in our example, this was the graph 2 example, the adaptive style. We know the adaptive style would produce a star. So in this case, what we would look for, since it's a high I style, we'd go over here to the I quadrant, and we would look for the D, S, and C looking below the line. And as you can see, it's not going to be an exact match here because actually the D is lower than these two, but this is going to be the best fit. So in this case, this person's graph number 1 star plot will be plotted in quadrant number 3 on the wheel, because again, this D is below the line, the I is above the line and high, and the S is below the line, the C is below the line. So this graph here looks a lot like their graph number 1. That's going to be the best fit, and their star will show up in quadrant number 3. All right. In the second example with graph number 2, of course, this is going to be a dot plot on their Success Insights graph. So again, what we're looking for is we're staying in that I quadrant, right? In this I quadrant because of the high I scenario. But now what happened was the S and the C's come above the line and the D stayed down below. So we're looking for that graph with the D below the line, and then the I, which is above the line, it's higher than the other 2 plot points of the S and the C. So in quadrant number 47, that's a little tough to read, but you can see it on the other graphic. In quadrant number 47, that's going to be the best match to this particular graph. So the dot plot's going to appear on their Success Insights graph in quadrant 47. So what's really important as you're debriefing these graphs is making sure that you have this slide here as a handout, and then they can just kind of pull out their graph number 1 and their graph number 2. You can encourage them to put the line graph on the dot plots and connect the dots to create a line graph. Give them this handout, have them sit it next to each other, and kind of walk them through the placement of their graphs in a best fit scenario. That should explain 95, 98% of the different plots. If for any reason their plot is not placeable, it's probably because it doesn't really match up accordingly close enough to the 60 to put on the graph. And we can talk more about that kind of on the side note, because there are some specific situations or circumstances, but that should be, like I said, a very low percentage of the time. What's kind of fun if you're going to do this exercise with the graphs too is you can kind of take it one more step. And we utilize these descriptors in our course classes when we do DISC certification. And inside of a TTI management staff report, they'll actually have a shaded area here inside of their report with a descriptor page. They can use this descriptor page, in which case it's shaded according to their graph number 2, but they can use this as kind of a reference to say, where do I think maybe a colleague plots? So by using the descriptor page, sorry about that, I can say, as far as the D quadrant is concerned, how they approach problems and challenges, what are some statements that maybe describe this colleague I work with? Are they down here, kind of unassuming and laid back? Are they fairly impatient, pretty bold when it comes to getting things done? So I can plot them, their D, their I, their S, and their C plots using the descriptor graph. And then I can basically say, based on the descriptor graph, if this is the energy line, where does that approximately plot out? And then I can put them onto the wheel simply by looking at this line graph and then referencing our wheel graph and saying where do they fall in regards to this wheel. And a lot of times I encourage them to use their own wheel in their report. So the last page of their report, they'll actually have their star, their adaptive star plot, their natural dot plot, and they could plot, let's say, Tom Jones. If we're using that as a team member, I would say, what does Tom's graph look like? Where does it go? And then I can get a feel for where that falls with relationship to my own style, and talk a little bit about things I might want to do differently as far as interacting with Tom Jones. Okay, so that's how we can use the wheel, and again, a really quick explanation. So hopefully that's helpful to you, but like I said, happy to connect if you have any additional questions. So for right now, that's the sum up on the wheel, and just taking those graph 1 and graph 2s and getting them plotted over on the Success Insights wheel. Hope it's been helpful.